And when I read the article, it hit me like a ton of bricks, a conversation I had many years ago with Dan Paff. He said, you have to use your filter because we have so much information. Your filter has to be your first principles knowledge. And I thought, Dan, what are you talking about, first principles knowledge? You have to understand physics. You have to understand physiology. You have to understand biomechanics and psychology. I said, okay. And he said, you don't have to be a master at those, but you better be a generalist at each of those. That'll help you better critique information, critique any kind of technology, and how you're going to use that said technology. Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. This episode will be very new for me. Today, the second episode of 2024 will be more of a monologue and a reflective piece. First and foremost, thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to host this podcast and listening on a bi-monthly basis. We've had to date over 51,000 downloads, and that's in large part to individuals like yourself. I started this podcast really for three reasons. Number one, selfishly, I wanted to learn. I felt that I could pinpoint and target the individuals that I wanted to learn from to backfill some knowledge gaps that I had, create new friendships, new colleagues, and in doing so, bullet number two as to why I started a podcast, scale a message, scale a positive message, educate a larger demographic. Had the opportunity to self-publish 2 books. It was actually quite a lonely process. And I thought the podcast medium would be a fantastic opportunity to scale a message to a larger audience. And last but not least, I wanted to leave a legacy and leave the game in a better place. Now, it might sound like a bunch of hot air, but I love the game of hockey. Our family loves the game of hockey. I've been involved since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Had the opportunity to play minor hockey in Canada, played college hockey, played minor pro hockey. We run a hockey school. We've run a hockey school for the past 25 years, been involved in the physical capacities and training athletes, and majority being hockey players for the past 20 years as a small business. So I wanted to leave a legacy. And I thought, this second episode of 2024 to be more reflective and to highlight some of the guests in 2023 and the lessons that I learned from them. It's a challenge when you're a podcast host. Do you ask too many questions? You have too big of a mouth, or do you just shut up and listen? I listen to a podcast every week called Econ Talk. And the podcast interviewer, I think does a masterful job. His name's Russ Roberts. By the way, side note, download the podcast. It's absolutely outstanding. It has nothing but everything to do with hockey. It has nothing but everything to do with complex systems, performance, etc. Very, very, very important information that you can pick up and apply in our setting. But nonetheless, I try to emulate Russ's interview style. I try to, be very prepared when I have a guest on, ask poignant questions, and then I like to zip my mouth and shut up and let everybody else listen. Now, certainly I throw my opinion in there as well, but I figured for this particular episode, I'd highlight some of the guests that we've had and then throw in my 2 cents and some of the lessons that I picked up. So I want to do so really outlining 5 episodes. And then obviously I want to thank every individual in 2023 for being on the High Performance Hockey Podcast. It's been a labor of love. And I look forward to a positive 2024 and onward and forward, as my father would say. So without further ado.
The people that are all about block practice, they miss out on the game stuff. And the people who are all game or all block practice miss out on, let's be athletes. You have to work on skating. So I would think that there needs to be a period where you're teaching skating, another period you'd have to work on stick handling, another period you'd have to work on shooting, and then you put all these things together. Because if the kids don't have the skills and you put them in a game, they're not going to be good. But if all you do is the robotic skill stuff, then they never have a chance to implement it and see how that's paying off. This is all a big balance between fun and repetition.
I want to start with the most proximate episode. And although this didn't happen in 2023, it was the first episode of 2024. And that was with Jim Kielbaso. The episode was titled Rethinking Long-Term Athletic Development. Massive passion point for me. Long-term athletic development, American development model that you'd hear in hockey. We've heard this a long time in physical literacy circles, strength and conditioning, whether you're working at a college, high school, university setting. We've heard that in youth sports, whether you're soccer, lacrosse, hockey, etc. Long-term athletic development. Jim wrote an article that I thought was masterful called Rethinking Long-Term Athletic Development. Side note here is I first got turned on to Jim from Fergus Connolly. And we've run a hockey school for 25 years. We've been doing it. And we focus on fundamental skill development for youth age groups, all the way from ages 6 to high school kids. And we also have done 20 years plus with the same age demographic in the weight room. So it's something that I really, really am passionate about. And Jim in his article talks about some of the shortcomings of this model. I think it's important to know he's not speaking poorly about the model. All models are wrong. Some are more useful than others. I think it's important that we understand the assumptions of any kind of model before we apply it and before we speak about it. And Jim does a great job in the article. In it, I want to highlight one quote that I thought hit me like a ton of bricks. And this is a quote from Jim. Quote, "Kids are not robots, and developing athletes is not a science experiment. We don't need models, we need coaches. Great coaches." Jim talks about the need and the importance of motor skill acquisition, specifically at younger ages. And I want to take that and talk about from my experience now. I told you I was going to do that this podcast here. So we have an opportunity at our hockey school to really focus on age demographics, really, really sensitive in terms of skill acquisition, right? Let's backtrack here. The American development model, they talk about 7 stages of that model, okay? You have active start. You have what they call fundamentals, learn to train, train to train, train to compete, train to win, and active for life. But let's talk and ignore those stages. Let's just talk about the age demographic of ages 6 to 12. Really passionate about that age in terms of motor skills on the ice. And Jim talked about this idea of really balancing repetition with games. And that's what I'm seeing right now in young and youth hockey right now, specifically for those age demographics. I see this huge bell curve. And unfortunately, what I see is the tails on the left or right being used mostly. That far right of the tail is play hockey year round, travel hockey for an 8-year-old, travel all over the world. There is no off season. And then the polar opposite left tail is everything is a game. No block practice, just have fun, let the kids self-experiment. My opinion strongly is the answer lies somewhere in the middle. So Jim discusses this need for being a great coach, understanding both the game, understanding motor acquisition, so the science, and then understanding physical competencies. That to me is rare this day and age. I think it's critically important to understand all 3. Let me talk really briefly about motor acquisition and those ages that I mentioned, ages 6 to 12. If you talk about long-term athletic development, and if you just say, Anthony, what long-term athletic development is to me, take the stages away, is don't specialize too early. Let the kids have fun. Couldn't agree more. Okay, so no one's debating this fact of not having fun. What I am debating is skill acquisition. And I think block practice is very, very important for those critical ages. What do I mean by block practice? If you're on the ice working with a youth group and you're quote unquote have 4 or 5 stations at hand, block practice means that if you're in a station for 5 to 7 minutes, you're working on one skill. Maybe it's passing for 5 minutes. Maybe it's shooting. Maybe it's stick handling. Random practice, in comparison, is gameplay, randomness, using multiple skills, skating, passing, shooting, puck handling in more chaotic environments. If you look at a lot of the research from Bernstein, Wolf, Davies, etc., what they would say to us, acquire a motor skill takes repetition. To retain a motor skill, more randomness, right? But you can't retain what you don't have. Block practice is critically important. Think about playing the guitar. You don't just go and just start jamming and playing as hard as you can. You have to learn a chord first. Now, that doesn't mean you can't just you can't self-experiment and go play on your own. Many people can do that. But structure is not a bad thing in learning the requisite skill. Quite frankly, it's very, very important. Repetition is the master of that. So, as coaches at a young age, I think it's important to understand the fine balance between gameplay and block practice, random practice and block practice. And that was something that Jim had expanded upon. This other idea is just a misunderstanding of the model in general and it being too rigid in its application. I think it's really, really important to understand what a model is. A model is assumptions of experts, okay, used to make predictions. All models in some capacity have flaws in them. I think it's really, really important before you speak about long-term athletic development, before you speak about any kind of model, to understand the assumptions of the model at hand. I am not planning on doing that on this podcast, but I can tell you this right now. I strongly encourage you to read John Kiley's piece, 21st Century Periodization. The assumptions behind periodization are identical to the assumptions behind long-term athletic development. Top-down approach is warranted. We can predict biological adaptation, etc., etc. The list are the same assumptions for periodization. What John Kiley is not saying is, no, do not periodize. That's not what he's saying. He's saying have a reflexive as opposed to a rigid approach to development. And I would say and echo the same thing when it comes to long-term athletic development. Again, been doing this for 25 years with our hockey school. Block practice can be extremely fun. Structure can be extremely fun. Doesn't mean you don't play plenty of games. It doesn't mean you don't experiment and work on those skills in a random fashion. That's not the take-home message. It's balancing. And that really was an eye-opener for me and Jim. And during our conversation, strongly urge you to listen to episode 56. Jim does a masterful job. One word answer, buddy, two at most. What is the one word when you read it or hear it that you have to pause, take a deep breath, and stop yourself from throwing your phone across the room?
You know what one drives me crazy? Heuristic.
Heuristic.
I'm like, why the hell can't people just use regular words? Why should I have to look shit up?
Mike, define that shit. I don't even know what you're talking about right now.
I used to have written on my wall 16, 2, and 6. And 16 was the number of hours of work I could get done a day. 2 was for travel and eating, and 6 hours sleep.
If you want to be good, you might have to be a little out of balance in the beginning. Everybody that I know has probably had this same struggle. It's just a matter of what the toll was. Like, what do you pay for it?
In 1989, I had to do a big U-turn on how I operate and think. Just real rigid programs that are too long, too complex. I'm still apologizing to athletes 50 years later for what I put them through.
There's very few people who have a legit interest in helping their athletes get better, not just trying to sell their program, their system, to say that, yeah, I'm the all-knowing expert.
Episode number 53 and 52. It was a two-part episode. Wow, you have to be kidding me on this one. I got this idea. It was mine, and then I texted the Irishman, Fergus Connolly, and he said, you're crazy. You got to try it. I said, I'm getting my mentors on one podcast. I'm doing it. I don't care how I'm going to do it. I'm just going to shoot. By the way, I hate group texts. I hate them. And I said, you know what? I'm going to shoot a group text. I'm going to shoot it to Dan Paff, Fergus Connolly, Mike Boyle, and the man himself, Buddy Morris. And I'll be darned, every single one of them got back to me almost immediately. We finally agreed on a date, and it was one of the coolest 2 hours that I've ever had. I said it in the podcast. I'll say it to you as my friends and listeners. These are the people that if you said, hey, you can have dinner and have a beer and have a cigar with any of these individuals, could you get them all in one room? This would be the room. And I talked about the importance each had on my career. Mike Boyle, just an unbelievable human being. Had the opportunity to work a quad cycle with him in the Olympics. Fergus Connolly, one of my closest friends, one of the smarter guys that I know. Dan Paff, mentor, the human encyclopedia, serial generalist. and Buddy Morris had a massive impact on my career in terms of programming. And I think for me, the coolest thing about it was we really didn't talk a lot about X's and O's. We talked about life. We talked about mistakes. We talked about balance. We talked about what really matters. And I think obviously you have to know your stuff, but at the end of the day, it's a people business. And the interpretation or the understanding of the program may be more important than the program itself. And that happens as a conduit through great communication, belief, and trust. That was something I hope the listeners got across during the message and during the interview. The other thing I thought was really interesting is this idea of mistakes, and many of them, including mine early in my career, and throughout my career, was this idea of just focus, 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 study, study, study. You're in it so deep, that you fail to account for the most important things in life. And I thought, Mike started by sharing, his, I wouldn't call them failures, but his story. And soon after that, Buddy piggybacked on, and Dan and Fergus did as well. And I thought it was just a really, really unique and sobering moment that hit me. Hey, Anthony, wow, these guys have all really, really, really given their lives to this profession, and it came at a cost. And Mike was quick to point out, which I thought was awesome. You have to understand that cost at an early age, you better be all in, and you better want to work, and you better want to kind of sleep at the water fountain to get better at an early age. That's how you stay in it. It's a passion pursuit, certainly. And I thought it was masterfully stated by all the guests during that podcast. The other cool moment in that podcast, and I have to say, some of these questions were put on by the Irishman himself, Fergus Connolly. He sent me some of these questions in advance, and wow, Fergus has a cool way of thinking. But this was a question that I posed. One word answer, two at most. What is the one word when you read it or hear it that you have to pause, take a deep breath, and stop yourself from throwing the phone across the room? And I thought all of these were just brilliant. So first, Buddy Morris, muscle memory. I started laughing. Buddy, he's a passionate guy, and he actually almost did get up. And the veins were sticking out of his bald head. It was hilarious. 2, Michael Boyle, heuristic. And he said, "Sorry, Ant, because you use that too much." Dan was quick to say it's rule of thumb, Mike. But I thought that was funny. But the 2 that I thought were just wow were Fergus's response and Dan Pfaff's response. Dan said, "Transfer." Wow, wow, wow. Let me just unpack that a bit. Transfer. I spent the first decade of my coaching career thinking that everything in the weight room, transferred on the ice. And the reality is, I'm not taking anything away from strength training. That is low-hanging fruit. I think it's critically, critically, critically important. But transfer, wow, wow. That's debatable. That's debatable. And it's very debatable. If you look at some of the research for hockey, transferring to speed on the ice, one would say sprinting and jumping, the ability to exert force very quickly. But there's just so many variables that go into being a good hockey player. The weight room, although we feel it's very, very important, and I think it's very important, is very, very sticky and very, very debatable in terms of transfer on the ice. And then Fergus Connolly said prediction. And that was another one that just smacked me, right? We're in a metric-crazed environment right now. Everything is a measure. Everything's being used to, quote unquote, objectify and predict. And I think Fergus was brilliant in his response. I think that it's a very, 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 very difficult to predict in complex environment, right? Looking back and creating a story after the fact is easy. That's easy. That's retrospection. But to use that to predict, wow, very difficult, perhaps impossible in team sports, because the final predictor in team sports is the scoreboard. So those were 2 big ahas for me: the mistakes, the personal stories, and those one-word answers. Gentlemen, I can't again thank you for your time. That to me was a massive, massive bucket filler for me, a bucket list filler, To get all those guys in one room was truly special. Thanks from the bottom of my heart, you guys. It was an unbelievable episode.
Today's episode has been brought to you by Physical Preparation for Ice Hockey, Biological Principles and Practical Solutions, and the Gain Go Grow Manual. This is a two-part book series exploring training the intermediate and advanced level players. Book number 1 explores training the intermediate player. Chapters include long-term athletic development, considerations, speed training, power training, strength training, and program design. The Gain Go Grow Manual explores training the high-performance hockey player. Chapters include biomechanics of ice hockey, considerations for high performers, minimizing adaptational risks while upsizing gains, the Gain Go Grow model, and example microcycles. More information can be found at Amazon.com.
When your top guys are as committed as everybody else on your team to the parts of the game that maybe aren't that glamorous, with, back checking and finishing checks and blocking shots and all that, I do think there's a bond that's created up and down your lineup that makes you a pretty formidable group to be contended with when you get on the ice. And I can honestly tell you, every team that I've been on that's won has had that.
All right, episode 47. John Stevens, 3-time Stanley Cup champ, 2 with the LA Kings, and 1 with the Vegas Golden Knights. Had the opportunity to meet John at the start of the 2022-2023 hockey season. I went down 4 to 5 days before training camp to hang out with my brother. My brother Misha was an assistant coach for the Stanley Cup winning team. And I had the opportunity to really spend some time with John, during their course of the morning and their briefs and their debriefs. And wow, what a smart hockey man. What a humble human being. And I really, really enjoyed his company and learning from him. And he was gracious enough to get on the podcast with me. And it was an unbelievable opportunity. And the question I asked him, I thought was really important. I said, looking at the teams that won the Stanley Cup, aside from talent, what are the intangibles that made it fortunate enough to win and hoist Lord Stanley? And I thought his response was really, really unique. He said, number 1, you got to have strength down the middle, the guts, the spine. So you have to have 4 deep and the center position. 2, back end, right? I mean, if you look at Vegas's back end, wow, their top 6 were just outstanding. Big, could move the puck, unbelievable, grit, shot blocking, etc. Depth at the 4th line and 3rd pairing positions in terms of your 4th line and your 3rd D pairing position. And I think this last one was really, really unique to me. And I know early in 2022, I interviewed Dave King as well, and he piggybacked on this idea. And he said, you have to be committed to playing without the puck. When the ice gets small and guys are really, at playoff time, you have to be committed to playing without the puck, sacrificing, doing your job. The stars have to be the stars, but the perfect example that John gave was Jack Eichel. I mean, an outstanding talent. But if you looked at his playoffs, putting faces in front of pucks, blocking shots, making big hits, sacrificing for the team. And arguably one of the most talented guys on the team. So he was playing and he was committed without the puck. And I thought that was a fantastic response. The other thing I thought was really interesting, and I get more passionate about it, is the on-ice component for me. The first decade of me in strength and conditioning, everything was about the weight room. And for me now, I really, really enjoy getting on the ice with the guys. I think a lot of that was inspired by the fact that I was a player. I played college and minor pro hockey, but probably more proximate is my brother Misha. He's an assistant coach in the National League, but he's put together return to play programs for players that have been injured. He's been a skills coach, and obviously through our communications with our hockey school, it's something I've been drawn to more and more, just getting guys on the ice in the target context and the target environment. And I asked John about how he designs his summer skills with his kids. He's got he's got 2 men that play in the American Hockey League, former Division I college hockey standouts. And he talked to me about the non-compromised drill sets in his practice plan. He said, number one, I want to always have a puck protection drill, regardless of what time of the year it is, early off season or, getting ready for training camp. And I always want to focus on wall work. I always want to focus on wall work. And it made me think of that Kucherov article that I read, talking about his intense focus on skill development with Adam Oates in the summer. And he focuses not so much on conditioning. He focuses on the repetitive patterns of the game. And that was also very important to me. Look at a National Hockey League game. Look at the power play, the penalty kill, the special teams. Look at the patterns every single shift. The importance of wall work, the importance of protecting the puck in confined areas, taking it to the house. Those are elements that are non-compromised in terms of his skill sets that he puts together for his teams. And truth be told, once we focus on our skill and our warm-up acquisition, when we focus on later in our lessons, we're heavily, heavily influenced by, obviously, my brother Misha and some of the dialogue that I had with John. So, John, thank you for that.
The history of the squeeze test as a measure of adduction strength, it was really developed as a provocative test, a symptom test, and we've done some work on that, looking at squeeze tests. But others, Christian Thorberg in Denmark did work on that. And then right around the time we showed that weakness of your adductors was a risk factor for adductor strains, there was a NHL league-wide study which said that weakness was not a risk factor. And in that test, they used the same dynamometer that we used. But what they did was they had people lying down, knees bent, and they squeezed the dynamometer between their legs. And they would actually report numbers for the right and the left leg. And I'm going like, how do you do that? You squeeze something between your legs. Newton's third law of action and reaction, I think it's his third law.
That's it.
Is for every force there's an equal and opposite reaction. So when you squeeze something, the force on each side is the same.
Episode number 45. Mal McHugh, Dr. Mal McHugh. I met Mal through a friend of mine, Reg Grant. Reg has been a hockey person almost before I was in diapers. He's been the New York Rangers performance director for eons, and he had an opportunity to work with Mal hand in hand. And he said, Anthony, you got to get this guy on the podcast. He's done a ton of research on the combine. He's had a ton of experience regarding the metrics and the training camp numbers in the National Hockey League. Super, super bright person. And I think you'd enjoy not only asking him some questions, but also his ideas on testing. And so I reached out to Mal, and he was kind enough to get back with me in a timely fashion. We had about a 45-minute conversation before we even had the interview. And I remember, being just completely overwhelmed by his knowledge. And he sent me 3 articles. And one was called Adductor Strains in Athletes. It was published in 2023, and I will link that. And it was linked to the show notes when I interviewed Mal, called The Case Against Adductor Strains. That's the episode. Or The Case Against Adductor Testing. My apologies. I want to go over my narrative of what was written in that article. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with Dan Pfaff many years ago. But let me start with this article, Adductor Strains in Athletes. He talked about the key requirements for hip adduction strength testing. So how do we test hip adduction strength? Number 1, a comparison can be made between the involved and non-involved sides. So if we're looking for an adduction to abduction ratio, we have to have a comparison between sides. Number 2, a comparison can be made between the agonist adductors and antagonist muscle groups. Okay? And number 3, the unit of measurement for strength allows comparisons across multiple populations. Now, Mal was not a fan of adductor squeeze testing to get an adductor to abductor ratios. Okay, there are tools now, there's technologies that measure that with an adduction squeeze test. And Mal was not a fan, and he talked about physics being a reason he wasn't a fan and neurophysiological reasons. And when I read the article, it hit me like a ton of bricks, a conversation I had many years ago with Dan Paff. He said, you have to use your filter because we have so much information. Your filter has to be your first principles knowledge. And I thought, Dan, what are you talking about, first principles knowledge? You have to understand physics. You have to understand physiology. You have to understand biomechanics and psychology. I said, okay. And he said, you don't have to be a master at those, but you better be a generalist at each of those. That'll help you better critique information, critique any kind of technology, and how you're going to use that said technology. So Mal, I went on to read his article, and he talked about his reasonings behind and against adductor squeeze tests. He said, number one, Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite in reaction. If you're squeezing a pad between, your left and right are going to squeeze equally. You cannot get a left and right or an adduction to abduction difference by squeezing something together. That's Newton's third law. Wow. Thanks, Mal, for reminding me. Dan, thanks for reminding me 3 years ago. And then the other one was a neurophysiological, and that is the bilateral deficit. The sum of forces generated left to right is greater than the sum of forces together. So it's another reason why that particular test is not good to get an adduction to abduction ratio. Mal goes on to talk about superior ways of doing that. In the article, it's beautifully illustrated, and we talk about it more in the actual interview. I will tell you that was probably the biggest aha moment for me of 2023. It was. And it hit me, I thought you might say, well, Anthony, that's it? That's your big aha moment? It really was. Again, and I'm not speaking out against any company. I'm not speaking out against any technology, but I think it's incumbent upon us as practitioners, as scientists, as exercise scientists, as performance directors to understand what is involved in these tests, understand first principles, and use that to make a filter of what we should and shouldn't be doing in terms of our battery of testing. I'll piggyback on that as well because I thought it was interesting. Not an episode that I'm highlighting, but Franco Impellizzeri talked about this, and it was really important. He talked about validity, and he said validity is it's a broad idea, but it's narrowly applied. And he talked about the validity of testing certain things. So you might have something that's very valid for testing heart rate, right? Like a heart rate monitor, but it's not valid for testing neuromuscular fatigue. And I'll give you a beautiful example. We have the First Beat system. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I have the Rogue bike. I hate that thing, and I get on there and go as hard as I can for 10 miles. About 40% of that ride is at threshold for me. I move, and I look at my TRIMP score, and it's in about the 80s to 100s after I get off that bike. TRIMP is training impulse. It's essentially duration of time multiplied by the intensity and the zone of your heart rate. That is a very valid reading for my heart, for my internal load. If I took that same First Beat watch and I did a Pat Davidson 30 for 30 mass, which would make me so sore the next day I couldn't sit down, my TRIMP score might be 40, 35. Now, one is extremely valid for measuring internal load. One is not very valid for measuring neuromuscular fatigue. Okay, so those are really, really important concepts. But I think it's really incumbent to circle around this whole idea, to wrap it up with a bow on Dr. Mal McHugh and what he taught me is understand your first principles. Okay, understand your first principles before you make decisions on any kind of technology, any kind of metric, any kind of measurement. So thanks, Mal.
What the plus minus tells you, and this is what's so important about it, is there's tons of stuff that happen in any sports, especially team sports, that are very difficult to measure. Help defense. You can't measure help defense. There's no steal, there's nothing. You're not doing anything. You're not achieving a stat, but you're just making it difficult for people to score. Or, things like moving across the court to open up a gap for somebody else. You can't measure gap opening. It's very difficult. It's very subjective, but it's what gets points, right? So same thing in, think about hockey. It's not just passing or completed passes. It's did you get the defense out of position to make an opportunity for somebody else? And so a lot of times you look at some of the best players in team sports are not the people who are making all the goals. It's the people who are making the plays.
Last one that I want to speak about, episode 43 with Peter Shrivers. Peter wrote a book called Bad Data. I was on this data fix in 2023. I read everything, statistics, data, I say everything. I use that tongue in cheek, but I wanted to understand we're all talking about numbers. We're all talking about metrics, and I want to talk about perhaps the limitations in our thinking when it comes to objectifying performance or objectifying information. So I read Peter's book called Bad Data. Outstanding book, strongly recommended. Had the opportunity to reach out to Peter. He immediately obliged, and we got on the podcast together. So I'm going to outline a couple of the chapters of his book I think are really, really interesting and important. Here are the chapters: Teaching to the Test, Goodhart's Law; Ins and Outs, the Logic Model and Program Evaluation; The Forest and the Trees, Simplifying Complex Systems; and Not Everything that can be counted counts, the Lamppost Problem. Wow. So right off the get-go, I asked Peter a little bit more along the lines of why we measure in general. And he quoted a David Mannheim quote. He said, we measure for three reasons, really. Number one, we want to get quote-unquote truth. And he said quote-unquote truth, not truth, right? In science, there is no real truth. We have superior explanations. When I say quote-unquote truth too, I'm not being funny or smart. Here's how I view objective information. I call it the metric hamburger. I get a number, maybe it's my force plate number, right? That's the number. That's the meat. That's the patty. On each side is a bun. Who decides that that metric's important is one bun? How do I analyze that metric as another bun? Even in the best of times, we are subjective beings. So I use truth in air quotes. Why do we measure? Reason number two, to simplify complex systems. Very, very important. Yes, as performance coaches, we deal with complex systems. I think, and I'll point my thumb, early in my career, I confused complex with complicated. They're not the same. Clouds are not clocks. Clocks are not clouds. And then the last but not least is to enable trust. If I have an objective number, I can talk to you about it, and it's not my opinion. We're no longer throwing our opinion in. It's a number. So I thought that was interesting right off the get-go. But as I dove more and more, some of the chapters really stuck out, and I wanted to share with you. Number one is ins and outs, this idea of the logic model. And what is the logic model? I learned they use it for nonprofit organizations to evaluate success or evaluate their objectives. And this model is composed of inputs, outputs, and outcomes. Okay? Inputs, outputs, and outcomes. In sports science, the inputs might be the people behind the scenes, the outputs may be the testing results, and the outcomes would be the scoreboard. And, you know, what Peter talked about is it's difficult to measure the outcomes. Inputs and outputs are the simple part, but the outcomes are more difficult to measure. The logic model for nonprofit organizations does a pretty darn good job. And to me, the big take home for me was this idea, and Fergus Connolly talks about it all the time, is start from the scoreboard and work backwards. The most difficult things to measure are those closest to the scoreboard. The low-hanging fruit doesn't mean it's not important, but we can't confuse that with a bountiful harvest. The second chapter that really stuck out at me, the forest and the trees, simplifying complex systems. Peter talked and I talked about this idea of we're getting really good at measuring trees, but sometimes we lose complete track of the forest. Like if you turn a National Hockey League game on right now, you've got every statistic thrown at you. When they win the face-off, the first 5 minutes of a game, they win the game 62% of the time. Corsi, Fenwick, expected goals, et cetera, et cetera. We're looking at trees every time we take these measures. Peter said, Anthony, in order for us to try to do a better job, he said, I just fall back on something super, super simple. If I want to try to look at the forest, simple plus minus. Are you on for a goal or are you against for a goal? And do you tally that up at the end of the year? Gives a better idea of the whole as opposed to looking at trees. And that stood out at me. It's a complex and complicated game. we're really trying to measure whether it's game speed, whether it's external load. There's just so many variables that go into it. We've got to remember a lot of these things, the context that goes along with it. What time of the game is it? What kind of player is it? Is it a power play? Is it a penalty kill? The numbers are just numbers. We have to provide that context, and we have to do a good job. And I'm challenging myself to always say, okay, is it a tree? How does that apply to the forest? If that makes any sense. That's how my brain thinks when I read and when I read some of Peter's work. And not everything that can be counted counts. The lamppost problem. Peter sums this up very, very beautiful. He said, with any complex situation, choosing what not to count is just as important as choosing what to count. That was a really eye popper for me. It was a fantastic aha moment for me. I think for me and metrics and data, I try to keep it as simple as possible. I'll share with you what we track in the summer. We're looking at rate of force development with our vertical jumps on our force plates, mid-thigh pull, peak force, time to peak force. We look at body comp, and we look at our sprinting. To us, that's the closest correlates to on-ice speed. Notice I didn't say being a great hockey player. There are other things I think as well that are really valid. Obviously, tracking game workload during games I think is important, but we have to understand that they all are not perfect measures. And we have to understand, as Franco said, the validity of each measure as well. So those are the 5 episodes I really wanted to highlight. Some other episodes that I thought were just outstanding. Matty Price, people, principles, process, provision. He talked about the return to play. He talked about constructing his high-performance environment for the LA Kings. The Catapult Roundtable, unbelievable. All external load. Pat Davidson, the man that we talked about, the Wizard of Oz. That was an outstanding episode. Devin McConnell, behind the scenes of putting together the high-performance model for the Arizona Coyotes. Lassie Loxco, long-term athletic development in the European model. Franco Impellizzeri, Patrick Ward, and the list goes on. So again, I wanted to thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening, tuning in. I will say as well, if you'd be kind enough to write a review for Apple, iTunes, that would go a long way for me. And lastly, tweet or post on Instagram some ideas of some guests that you want to hear from, people that you think would be and scale an awesome message that we would all learn from in the hockey community to leave the game in a better place, to grow the game and to scale a positive message. I look forward to hosting more of these podcasts in 2024. Thank you so much for listening. Look forward to seeing you next.